Welcome to Please Leave Podcast, where you'll hear truly scary stories that you cannot get out of your head. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence or explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
It was 5:30 p.m. on a Friday, and I was stuck in the exact traffic that you would expect from a mid-sized city at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday. You know, the traffic where all of the vehicles are caught in the maddening process of pulling 2 cars ahead in your lane just to have 4 cars in the other lane pass you in the next moment. It was also mid-January, so it was particularly pitch dark by 5:30 p.m., increasing my hunger and need for a cocktail tenfold, especially after such a long week at my dead-end job as a mid-level manager at a company too boring to even try to explain. But that's what you do in your mid to late 20s, right? You work a terrible job that pays a decent wage while you wait for your life to show up, and drink as much as your human body can handle at any opportunity that presents itself. Well, maybe other people in their late 20s have it more together than I do, but that's my current state of affairs, and so I really needed to get home and get my drink on as soon as the traffic would clear up enough to allow it to be. I was lost in the haze of rush hour traffic monotony, barely humming along to the song on the radio and staring dazedly into the middle distance when I suddenly got the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. The hairs on my neck prickled as I suddenly became more alert, and I could tell that I was correct in my feeling because I could see movement from the car to the right of me in my periphery. I slowly turned in the direction of the movement, and my breath caught in my throat at what I saw. The car next to me was an excruciatingly typical mauve, mid-sized sedan. The kind of car that every middle-aged man in middle management you've ever met drives. The kind of car that filled my excruciatingly boring company's parking lot every day. And the man driving the car was equally typical looking. Mostly bald, middle-aged, pale-complected, white, ill-fitted button-up dress shirt unbuttoned one button, and I would assume he had a sad and very affordable briefcase or some kind of man bag sitting on the seat next to him, full of excruciatingly boring spreadsheets of some kind. The man looked like every uncle or suburban neighbor I'd ever seen, but he was staring directly at me, smiling the most sinister possible smile, and the most awful part was that he was making the scissor cutting motion with his fingers while he stared and smiled at me. His hand moved rhythmically in a circle in front of him, cutting, like a demented Danny Tanner on Full House, stuck in a ghoulish repetition of the first part of his signature catchphrase. I stared back, transfixed for a couple of seconds, then snapped out of it, and appalled by the strange man who was clearly taking advantage of the crawling traffic by getting off on some weird fetish from the relative comfort and protection of his car. I scanned around me, looking for an opportunity to merge out of my lane and away from the man, but was trapped in a momentary standstill. Luckily, the traffic in my lane started to inch forward, and I took the opportunity to pull ahead of the man, sighing a shaky sigh of relief as I did. I watched the man in my rearview mirror as I pulled ahead, expecting him to keep scissoring at the people in the car behind me. But the second I pulled out of view, I watched his smile drop, his head turn forward, and both of his hands return studiously to his wheel in the recommended 10 and 2 positions. What the fuck? I muttered to myself as I watched the man, sitting as any average middle-aged man would sit in traffic, as if he hadn't been threatening me with the strange gesture just seconds before. I relaxed as I managed to pull 3 cars ahead of him and could just begin to spot my exit several hundred feet in the distance. My relief was short-lived, though, because as soon as I'd begun to zone out again and forget about the bizarre interaction, the hairs on my neck were back at attention, and my instincts returned to tell me I was again being watched. And sure enough, I looked to my right and the man was right next to me, staring, smirking, and scissoring round and round in that isolated spot in front of his chest. This time I snapped into action, adrenaline pumping through my body, and immediately signaled and made my way into a slight opening in front of the Scissor Man and out of his view. I managed to cross another lane as we inched toward my exit, and relief flooded my body as I made my way onto the off-ramp and toward my apartment and the new bottle of vodka that waited for me inside of my freezer. Once again, though, my relief was short-lived as I glanced into my rearview mirror about a quarter of a mile after I exited and saw that ordinary mauve mid-size sedan following a few hundred yards behind me. "Oh, come on!" I shouted and accelerated, hoping I could lose him as I entered the downtown area where there would be streets and alleys to wind through. I could see him accelerating too as we got closer to the shops and restaurants lining the downtown of the small city, and I took the first right that I could, then a left, then chose an alley I'd never seen before and headed in the opposite direction of my apartment. I wound around like that for a while, aimlessly choosing a street to turn down, quickly losing my bearings in the town I'd inhabited for 6 years, but desperate to never see that strange man and his horrible gesture ever again. Once I was convinced I'd completely lost the creep, I navigated my way back to my complex and the cold vodka in my freezer and parked in my usual spot in the parking garage below the building I lived in. I took a deep breath before thoroughly scanning the small parking enclosure for any sign of creeps or mauve sedans, and when I was absolutely certain that the garage was as still as a grave, I threw open the door and half ran to the elevator. I jammed the elevator button and relaxed slightly when I realized the elevator only had to travel 2 floors to get to me, but I kept my back to the door the entire time just in case. Once the elevator arrived, I stepped inside and jammed the button to my floor and then rapidly smashed at the door close button, knowing full well that several pushes didn't make it work any faster, but being completely unable to stop myself as gentle tingles of fear ran up and down my spine. The doors slowly slid into place, and right before they closed completely and brought me to the safety of my apartment, I swear to God, I saw the slightly balding head of a middle-aged man slide from behind one of the parking garage posts and stare directly at me. I called building security, but of course they didn't find any sign of middle-aged creepers or their boring cars anywhere near the building, and by the time I reached the bottom of my 3rd vodka soda, I'd convinced myself I had hallucinated the face in the garage in the fog of my growing panic. Then 2 months passed, and there were no more sightings of bizarre older men or mauve cars, and so I eventually forgot about the strange interaction in rush hour at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday. Then 2 months to the day, we all received a memo that our insurance benefits were being repackaged due to rising costs, and we were all being scheduled to meet with a representative from HR and an insurance agent to go over the changes to those benefits. It was one of the many reasons jobs like mine will slowly dissolve a human soul, but I tried to look at it as an excuse, albeit a boring one, to get out of my cubicle for 20 minutes. I walked down the mind-numbingly neutral hall to the beige room next to a million other beige rooms in the building full of beige rooms from top to bottom, where I would meet with the insurance agent, and my blood ran cold when I opened the door. Sitting at a desk behind an Acer laptop in the middle of the beige room was the Scissor Man from the traffic jam. I stammered, starting to back out of the room slightly. "Oh, hi, Courtney," the HR representative chirped. "Come on in." I'm actually fine with whatever changes you've made to the insurance. Thanks, though," I said, and started to leave the room as the Scissor Man smiled an unassuming smile at me and slightly cocked his head. "Sorry, Court," HR squawked. "This meeting is mandatory, so come on in and help yourself to a bottled water." I took a deep breath to quiet the panic rising in my chest and circled the table to choose the chair that was the furthest away from the Scissor Man and his battered briefcase and stack of insurance folders. Scissor Man cleared his throat and passed me one of the folders, and in his very unremarkable voice, he instructed me to remove the first piece of paper in the folder so he could explain the comparison between my previous and current plans. If my body hadn't been surging with adrenaline, I might have passed out from boredom immediately. "Actually," he interrupted almost as soon as he'd begun, "Courtney's paper isn't the right one. He looked at the HR woman. Would you mind fetching the stack of pages I left in the copy room? I printed out the correct sheets and I forgot to swap them from this stack of folders. HR lady nodded wildly, overly excited to be of service, and bounded out of the room. My heart quickened and my mouth went dry at the thought of being left alone with the man, but I tried to tell myself that it wasn't the same person, and just because the man in the car had looked like a middle-aged insurance adjuster, it didn't mean that he was this middle-aged insurance adjuster. Silly me, he said, gathering the rest of his folders. I'd lose my head if it wasn't screwed on, he chuckled. Yeah, I hear you, I managed to say while shifting uncomfortably in my chair. I turned around in my chair to look at the small strip of glass that ran down the side of the door for any sign of HR lady, and when I turned around, my blood ran cold again. Scissor Man was back. The man was standing and suddenly smiling, his face transformed from a mild-mannered insurance agent to a soulless beast, and his hand was poised in front of his chest, pointer and middle fingers extended, the other 3 fingers tucked toward his palm, and the word "yeah" escaped his lips, and he started cutting. Oh yeah, he said again, cutting and cutting in that awful circular motion while staring straight at me. What the fuck? I shouted and scrambled for the door, knocking over my chair on the way. Who the fuck are you? You'll find out soon, Courts, he said and stopped cutting. Real soon. And just like that, his entire face changed back to the same tame, aging man who'd been in the room when I'd entered, and HR lady came back in at the same moment, holding the stack of papers. I lied and said we'd covered everything while she was gone and practically ran back to my desk, where I grabbed my things and left for the day after lying again and saying I was sick and had just thrown up. I drove around for a while, not knowing what to do exactly, and kept a watchful eye out for the mauve 4-door car the entire time. I could go to the police, but they would think I was nuts, and I was 100% sure they wouldn't do anything anyway. Even if scissor fingers counted as a threat, which I was pretty sure they wouldn't, I knew that they would just file a report and move on with their days, laughing about the girl and her scissor motioning stalker. I was too rattled and terrified to go home, so I texted a friend that I knew had a spare room and spent the rest of the night doing shots of a cupcake-flavored alcohol and playing video games to take my mind off the menacing insurance creep who I had somehow run into twice in 2 months. The cupcake shots took the edge off, and my very supportive and very logical friend talked me down and convinced me that while he was no doubt an absolute freak show, the man was most likely harmless, and it was just a very strange coincidence that I'd run into him twice. She said he clearly had a fetish to scare people and was probably stoked to run into me while at work to get his rocks off again, but it was nothing more than a god-awful coincidence. Nothing more. And she was right. It's been 2 more months, and there's been no sign of the fuckhead and his weird fetish for sewing implements. I still have the soul-suffocating job at the company that's too boring to mention, and I still get stuck in traffic at least 2 times a week, but there's been no sign of the creeper and his unforgivably sad sedan. It's Friday again today, and I spent a huge chunk of my evening crawling home in drooling anticipation of the espresso martinis my roommate texted that she'd be making when I got to the apartment. I got home around 7 and immediately called out for my roommate Marlene, not wanting to waste another second without a martini in my mouth, but the apartment was dark and eerily still when I opened the door. I snapped on the light and the living room was empty, but one of Marlene's outfits was laid out like a snow angel in the middle of the carpeted floor. One of her favorite blouses was perfectly posed with the arms outstretched, with her favorite jeans underneath, and her Tory Burch sandals that she loved so much, where each of her feet would be. "Marlene?" I called out again. "What's going on? You going out tonight?" I searched every room, but there was just no sign of her. There were no martini fixings on the countertop, no sign of her purse on the back of the chair where she left it every day after work, no sign that she'd been there at all since she'd left that morning. What the fuck? I asked myself and texted her to see if she got stuck in traffic too. I dragged out the vodka and some almost flat tonic water and mixed myself a drink while I waited. I snapped a photo of the drink in my hand and texted it to Marlene with the caption, "Help! but there was still no response. An hour passed and then 2, and by the time it sunk in completely that my roommate was ghosting me for the night, I was too drunk on half-flat vodka tonics to go anywhere by myself, so I tucked myself into bed with my laptop and promptly fell asleep. I awoke with the start a few hours later, some barely perceptible sound having jolted me out of my deep, drunken sleep. My hair stood on end as I listened, suddenly very sober for whatever had made the sound. My ears only registered silence for a couple of seconds, and then slowly, very slowly, I heard it. I heard the faintest sort of scraping sound, and it took me a moment to register what it was. It was the slow, rhythmic, awful sound of scissors cutting through something very soft. This story was written by Courtney Eck and narrated by Courtney Eck. For more scary stories that you cannot get out of your head, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/PleaseLeavePod. Please follow Please Leave on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at PleaseLeavePod. Our email is pleaseleavepod@gmail.com, and our website is pleaseleavepod.com. This has been a Two Penguins Media production.
Quack.